have a look at the Ghent altarpiece.
It is absolutely breathtaking, and it's really complicated.
It is. It's made up of many, many panels. It's a polyptych, and those panels are connected by hinges, so they open and close.
Which means that we actually see this set of paintings in two distinct ways. We either see it opened or closed, and this is important because I think it would be closed much of the year and then opened on feast days as a kind of revelation.
This would have had an elaborate frame.
There's some controversy about actually who painted it. This is generally ascribed to Jan van Eyck. Some suggest that his brother Hubert may have begun it. The frame was lost presumably during the iconoclasm, that is, the attacks on Catholic art during the Reformation.
And we also know that this painting was much coveted by the Nazis and was actually stored in a salt mine. We're lucky we still have it today. We have at the top some figures with scrolls and books, and those are prophets and sibyls who predicted the coming of Christ, the coming of a Messiah. And the moment that they predicted is actually unfolding right below them, and that is the scene of the Annunciation where the angel Gabriel is announcing to Mary that she is about to conceive Christ.
Gabriel over on the left panel, Mary 3 panels to the right, and then wonderfully empty space. Not empty, in fact, this fabulous cityscape and then a kind of still life on the right middle panel, but nevertheless an unoccupied set of spaces that suggest the opportunity for Christ's arrival.
And we have the usual trappings of the Annunciation. The angel Gabriel holds lilies, which are a symbol of Mary's purity, her sinlessness, her virginity. The angel Gabriel announces, and you can actually see words coming out of the angel's mouth. It's in Latin, Hail Mary, full of grace, blessed art thou among women. And Mary on the other side, with the dove above her head, which represents the Holy Spirit, and words coming out of her mouth, her reply to the angel Gabriel coming out backwards, right to left, instead of left to right, and upside down. Behold the handmaiden of the Lord. Backwards makes sense, right, because she's speaking back to the angel. It's very interesting that the words are also upside down.
It makes us question who she's speaking to, doesn't it?
Perhaps to God, who's looking from above.
Everything in this set of panels is very concrete and absolutely physical. And yet those words, because they're gold, but also because they're not attached to anything physically represented, are wonderfully ethereal and speak to God.
There is that tension between the writing, which is a very medieval thing to do. It reinforces the flatness of the image. And yet there's a tension between that and, as you said, the physicality of everything else. A sense of space. The objects that are depicted are incredibly real as the light reflects on them. That cityscape that goes out into a distance where we can see figures and shadows and buildings and birds, or that still life on the right where we see the sunlight from the windows beautifully reflected. Attention to detail that is very unique to the Northern Renaissance.
These artists were miniaturists, and that attention to detail comes through even on this large scale. But we don't want to say that this is the kind of naturalism or realism that we would have seen developed at this very time in Italy, because it's not. We're seeing a kind of awkward linear perspective, and the figures themselves look as if they might bump their heads if they actually stood up in this room.
The space seems to rush back, and also we're not seeing an attention to the reality of the human body that we would have seen in the Italian Renaissance. We have kind of drapery that seems to have a life of its own with lots of angular folds and almost seems to hide the body underneath. And we should say that the altarpiece is 11.5 feet high. It's really large. It's made for a private chapel in St. Bavo's Cathedral in Ghent that belonged to the patron who we see below.
So we have 4 figures, or 2 figures and then 2 sculptures, but that in and of itself raises a really interesting visual trickery. We take the figures who are dressed in red as real people, and then the sculptures in the middle carved of stone, but of course this is all paint.
The figures who are represented as sculptures are the 2 St. Johns, and I think they had particular relevance for the chapel and for the family. It's also interesting to look at the patrons, because there's that thing that you always see in the Northern Renaissance, which is this amazing ability to represent different textures, because of course the artists are using oil paint. And so that fur on his collar really seems like fur, and his skin really seems like the skin of an old man.
And of course oil paint will have a profound impact on the sense of this painting, but especially when we open it up. So let's open it up and take a look inside.
We're struck immediately by an explosion of rich colors.
And this is color that's really possible because of the luminousness of oil paint, especially in the way that the Northerners handled it.
And so there's an incredible sort of material beauty that is very palpable as soon as one opens it up, and we're struck immediately by this very large figure in the center of God the Father, dressed like a king with a papal crown on his head, a crown at his feet to show that he's King of Kings, holding a scepter, a symbol of power.
That scepter is exquisite. It's so clearly rendered out of rock crystal, and the crown at his feet is an amazing display of jewelry design, of jewelry making. And if we look past the exterior of the crown to the inside of it, we can actually see how it was hammered from the inside out.
We have a theme running through here of God's saving grace, God's saving power, his plan to forgive and redeem mankind.
That issue is so critical here, and this is one of the early great examples of God being remade in what we will come to know as the Renaissance, as opposed to the earlier medieval God that was wrathful, was terrifying. Here we have a God that is a God of forgiveness, and it is an expression of the humanist tradition that is developing in Europe at this time.
And on either side of God, we have on the left Mary, also wearing a crown, looking like a queen. The crown has roses and lilies in it, and on the right, St. John the Baptist. And to go back to that theme of God's redemption and forgiveness, in that gold embroidery, which we have in that tapestry behind God the Father, an image of a pelican. In the medieval tradition, the pelican, if its young were starving, it was believed to pick at its own flesh to feed its young.
This notion of God making this extraordinary sacrifice is explicitly rendered here.
On the left, we have the angels singing in heaven, and on the right, the angels playing music in heaven. So we have this not only incredibly rich environment visually of gold and jewels, but also the sounds of heaven.
If you look at the choir on the left and look at the richly carved furniture of the music stand, and on the right of the organ, I imagine that this is some indication of what the original frame of this painting might have looked like.
One of the things I really love is that each of the angels wears a different crown on the left as they sing, and they make slightly different faces as though you can tell the different notes that they're each singing.
Even though their faces are actually quite similar, they become a kind of, I imagine, a kind of ideal of beauty in Van Eyck's imagination.
And then when we go a little bit further out, we see the panels of Adam and Eve, who are represented very realistically, very sort of deeply human in their bodies, not at all idealized the way that we would see with Masaccio or the artists of the Italian Renaissance. Of course, the artists of the Northern Renaissance don't have ancient Greek and Roman sculpture everywhere to look at, which would suggest a tradition of idealizing or making perfect of the human body. And so here, Adam and Eve look like two real people that Van Eyck had modeled for him in his studio.
You have throughout this painting a kind of grandeur, and then you have these two figures naked, seem so vulnerable, they seem so out of place, they seem so mismatched. This painting is really about God's willingness to reach out to man in all of his imperfection.
Exactly.
And their jarring presence, this sense of discord, I think is a potent expression of the painter's interest in representing God's willingness to reach down to our imperfect world.
One of the other things that I'm really struck by is the gold embroidery in the figure on the right who's playing the organ, and the ermine on her gown, and even the attention that's being paid to the tiles on the floor, the pipes of the organ. We have that thing that happens in the Northern Renaissance where artists pay an enormous amount of attention to things that are seemingly unimportant, but we know that the artists of the Northern Renaissance lavish so much attention and care and detail and clarity on objects because they represent the heavenly and the spiritual. They link us to the heavenly and the spiritual.
It does something else as well, which is it makes concrete the heavenly world, and it makes it so understandable. It also makes it very believable and, in a sense, very tangible.
And in the scene below, we see an image with 4 groups of people coming toward a scene at the center, which is an altar with a lamb, and the lamb has a wound in its side and is bleeding into a chalice.
Because the lamb, of course, is a symbol of Christ's sacrifice. And yet here we have this lamb that has overcome any earthly pain, any earthly suffering, and is here functioning in the purely symbolic realm.
And surrounding that altar, we have angels who carry the instruments of Christ's suffering, the cross, the crown of thorns, the column that he was bound to when he was flagellated. And so we have this sense of sacrifice for man's redemption.
And then man, in these 4 large groups, come to pay homage.
And we have prophets and saints and popes and figures from the Old Testament who all make their way toward Christ. And below that, the fountain of life, which has a stream that leads out and down toward us and toward the altar in the chapel.
This is all played out in this glorious and divine landscape, this gem-like landscape where there's a kind of specificity that is overwhelming visually. Every leaf is rendered, every window pane in the city beyond is rendered.
Yeah.
You have not only a sense of the magnificence of God's realm, but you have the sense of overwhelming awe, because our eyes are incapable of taking in this much visual information simultaneously. This is a painting that's almost cinematographic in that you have to look through it over time in order to be able to take it all in. It is simply too much.
And so in a way, it suggests a kind of vision that transcends human vision, a divine vision. And in fact, one of the things that's said about Van Eyck as an artist is that he had an eye like a microscope and a telescope, showing us things very far away as though they were under a microscope, a kind of vision that only is possible for God.
So this disjuncture between man's limited vision, which we feel as we look at this painting, and this notion of God's complete vision.
Through this painting, transcending our earthly realm and coming face to face with God.